The first lock nailed over Moonrest Hospice was warm when the royal wolves laid the dying king at Annora Whitlock's door. Snow fell in thin silver lines across the hospice steps. Wax from the prince's closure seal had barely hardened on the black oak. Behind the door, 12 empty beds waited under folded winter blankets, each stripped of the name ribbon Annora had tied there by hand. She stood outside with the last basket of clean linen in her arms. Royal winter wolves, larger than warhorses, white-furred and moon-eyed, bound to no leash. They were last road beasts. By old moon law, they carried a failing sovereign toward the nearest recognized mercy threshold when ordinary royal care failed. Tonight they carried Wolf King Ossmere between them, his crown cloak dragged through snow. One placed the king's limp hand on Annora's sealed threshold. 3 hours earlier, Wolf Prince Garrick Ossmere had closed Moonrest. He had come with black budget ledgers, winter soldiers, and winter physician's severed crane at his right shoulder. Garrick wore mourning dark wool, though his father was still alive. That, Annora thought, was how the palace handled illness. Dress for death early, so no one had to care while the dying remained difficult. Several had read the decree aloud. By order of royal reform, Moonrest Hospice is dissolved as redundant care. Elder and terminal patients will be transferred to palace-approved channels as capacity permits. As capacity permits, Annora repeated. That means when there is room after the young, the useful, and the court-born. Severald's expression remained gentle. It means triage, Widow Whitlock. The title struck where he meant it to. Widow, not keeper, not hospice mistress, not the woman who sat through last breaths palace physicians found inconvenient. Annora let the insult pass through her. Moonrest is not waste, she said. It is where people come when the palace has finished counting them. Garrick's face tightened. For one winter after her husband's death, he had walked her home after dusk without touching her. Once, beneath the snow ash trees, he had said, no one should be left alone at the end. She had believed him. Now he looked at Severald's ledgers instead of her beds. The crown cannot fund duplicate care, Garrick said. My father's infirmary requires resources. Annora's voice stayed even. Then speak to the patients before you take their roof. Severald sighed. Many are not lucid enough for policy discussion. Annora turned to him. Not lucid does not mean not human. Garrick looked at her then, and pain crossed his face before duty hardened over it. Annora. The sound of her name made the cold sharper. No, she said. Do not make this tender because you are ashamed to make it cruel. Severald stepped in with practiced sorrow. Your Highness, sentiment is precisely why this reform has been delayed. Moonrest encourages families to avoid difficult decisions. Difficult decisions? Annora asked. You mean staying? You give them false comfort, Severald said. The kingdom needs sustainable care, not candlelit denial. Annora looked at the beds visible through the open door. One still held a carved wolf charm left by a dying grandfather beside a folded note no palace clerk had bothered to read. Comfort is not denial, she said. Sometimes it is the last honest thing left. Garrick closed his eyes for half a breath. Then he opened them and signed the order. The seal went onto the door before sunset. By moonrise, the palace sent no wagons for the displaced patients. Families carried elders through snow on kitchen chairs, doorboards, and their own backs. Annora wrapped blankets and gave instructions because dignity was easier to lend when she refused to spend hers. Garrick watched from his horse until the last bed was emptied. He did not dismount. That was what Annora would remember. The prince who once knew grief stayed mounted, while old women lost the only place where death still had a name. The palace infirmary had opened its white doors for the royal winter wolves. Severald's own attendants had called from the gate. The wolves had passed it without slowing. Now the royal winter wolves stood before the sealed door. Garrick arrived behind palace guards. He saw the king first, then Annora, then the closure seal across the door. What happened? He demanded. One of the wolves growled when Severald stepped forward. The physician froze. Annora looked at Garrick across the body of his father and the threshold he had denied to everyone else. You closed the place they trusted, she said. Garrick's face went pale. Open it. Annora did not move. Behind the seal, Moonrest waited empty because his order had made it so. In the snow, the king's breath rattled once while the wolves lowered their heads around him like a living wall. Annora set her linen basket down. Not for him first, she said. Garrick stared at her. She looked toward the road. I open Moonrest for everyone you put out, she said. Then I admit the king. Winter Wolf Threshold Record. After Wolf Prince Garrick Ossmere sealed Moonrest Hospice and displaced its terminal patients, the Royal Winter Wolves carried the failing Wolf King to Annora Whitlock's sealed threshold instead of the palace infirmary, showing that the king's last road care still recognized Moonrest as a mercy threshold after the closure decree. Severald Crane did not deny that the wolves had stopped at Moonrest. He denied that a sealed hospice could still carry mercy status after royal reform. Snow thickened around the locked threshold, while the dying Wolf King lay beneath 7 white bodies and a crown cloak stiff with frost. The Royal Winter Wolves did not growl now. They simply held the last road formation, heads low, paws planted on either side of the seal Garrick Ossmere had ordered nailed into Annora Whitlock's door. Garrick stared at that seal, as if command should have made it less real. Open the door, he said. Annora looked past him to the road where her patients had vanished into winter. Read the register before you read the seal. Severald's expression softened into public concern. Your Highness Old Moon, law registers are ceremonial, not funding authority. Annora did not answer him. She looked at Garrick. That was worse. He had once known the weight of her silence. After her husband died, he had walked beside it for a winter without trying to fill it. Tonight, he stood on the wrong side of the locked door and finally heard what silence could accuse without raising its voice. Bring the mercy register, Garrick ordered. Severald's eyes moved once, quick as a blade hidden under wool. His Majesty's condition cannot wait for archival delay. Annora knelt beside the king only long enough to check the rhythm at his throat. He is failing. He is not yet unattended. One wolf lowered its muzzle close to the king's shoulder, keeping him warm beneath its breath. Garrick saw the care and flinched. Annora rose. Ask whether a house stops being mercy because wax says so. A clerk arrived with a moon-silver book wrapped in oilcloth. The old Moon Law Mercy Register was not a budget ledger. It was older than Garrick's reform, older than Severald's office, older than the Winter Palace itself. It listed places where the dying could be carried when ordinary care failed. Garrick's voice roughened. Was Moonrest removed from the Mercy Register? The clerk opened the book with trembling hands. No, Your Highness. A small movement passed through the soldiers. Severald stepped nearer. One wolf's ear flicked toward him. He stopped. The motion was small, but every soldier near the steps noticed the threshold law before Severald named it Old Ceremony. Register update was pending clerical transfer, Severald said. The reform decree supersedes mercy, house listing. Annora looked at the seal. Then why did the wolves obey the listing and not the wax? Severald answered smoothly. Wolves follow ancient threshold memory, not current medical policy. Current medical policy sent no wagons, Annora said. Garrick turned sharply. Was the closure decree entered before the wolves left the palace? The clerk checked the reform copy. Yes, the closure seal was entered before sunset. And the mercy register? Unchanged, Your Highness. Moonrest Hospice remains listed as active mercy threshold. Severald lifted one hand. Active in ceremonial language, not operational funding. Annora's voice stayed calm. Death does not know the difference when a door is locked. The words landed in the snow between them. Behind Garrick, one guard lowered his eyes. The king coughed once beneath the cloak. Garrick, one guard lowered his eyes. The king coughed once beneath the cloak. Garrick moved toward him on instinct, but the lead wolf shifted, not attacking, only closing the last road circle. Annora spoke, before fear could turn the moment into force. They will not cross until the threshold is opened under its own rule. Garrick looked at her. Then tell me the rule. Mercy first admits by need, she said. Not rank. Severald's mouth tightened. Royal patient priority requires immediate admission. Displaced patients can be processed after His Majesty stabilizes. Annora turned on him. Processed? The word made the oldest wolf lift its head. Not judgment. Old Moon Law response at a mercy threshold. Annora stepped closer to the prince. Ask who counted my beds before they counted where my patients would go. Garrick looked toward the dark road. Were receiving beds assigned before closure? The clerk looked down at the reform ledger. Annora did not let the silence become another grave. Read that next. Severald's voice cooled. This is a procedural gap, not a care failure. Annora looked down at the Wolf King, then at the sealed beds behind her. A gap is what a clerk calls it when someone else falls through. Garrick's eyes closed. When he opened them, he did not apologize. Good. An apology would have been too small for the snow. Cut the seal, he ordered. Moonrest opens under last road rule. Several went still. For the king. Annora stepped in front of the door. For everyone displaced before him. Garrick's face tightened as the cost reached him publicly. Then he looked toward the road. Send riders, he said. Bring them back first. Care register contradiction. Moonrest Hospice remained listed in the old Moon Law Mercy Register after Garrick Ossmere's closure decree marked it dissolved as redundant care. The care register contradiction proved Moonrest still held mercy threshold status under old Moon Law. It did not yet prove whether Garrick Ossmere's reform had assigned receiving beds before displacing its terminal patients. The cut seal hung from the door in 2 torn strips of black wax. Moonrest had not opened fully. Annora Whitlock stood with one hand against the oak, keeping the threshold between the dying king and the 12 empty beds that should not have been empty. Behind her, the hospice smelled of cold linen, banked hearth ash, and the winter herbs she had not been allowed to use. Outside, the royal winter wolves held their last road circle around Wolf King Ossmere. None crossed. Old Moon Law had brought him to mercy. It would not make him first by crown. Garrick looked at the reform ledger in the clerk's hands. Read it. Several Crane's voice remained even. Projected transfer capacity satisfied reform procedure, Your Highness. Annora turned from the door. Read the beds before you read the reform. The clerk opened the receiving section. His eyes moved once, then stopped. Garrick saw it. Where were Moonrest's patients assigned? The clerk swallowed. No individual assignments listed. Several stepped closer, careful not to disturb the wolves. Receiving beds can be assigned after closure. Palace-approved channels were authorized. Annora looked toward the road where the riders had vanished. Ask whether a future bed can warm a body in tonight's snow. Garrick's jaw tightened. Was a receiving bed list attached? No, Your Highness. A soldier shifted near the steps. His boot scraped ice. One wolf lifted its head, then settled again when Annora held one palm low. Not command. Threshold quiet. Were the beds ready before closure? Garrick asked. The clerk turned a page that had nothing written on it. No readiness confirmation attached. Several gave a controlled sigh. Temporary displacement is not abandonment. Families were present. Families were carrying beds on doorboards, Annora said. The line took the shape of what everyone had seen and tried to survive, not naming. Garrick looked at her then. There had been a time when his eyes could soften winter. Tonight, softness came too late and too near to his own father's failing breath. Annora looked back at the ledger. Do not make what they carried invisible, because your paper did not. His gaze dropped first. Were families notified where to take them? Garrick asked. The clerk checked the notice copy. The notice says Palace. Approved channels would receive them as capacity permitted. That is not a location. No, Your Highness. Severald's mouth tightened. In a reform transition, flexibility prevents bottleneck failure. Annora's voice stayed calm. A dying woman is not a bottleneck. The oldest royal winter wolf breathed once over the king's cloak. Frost lifted and settled. The king's eyelids moved, but he did not wake. Garrick watched his father's mouth struggle for air, and for one dangerous heartbeat, Annora saw fear try to make him forget the rest. She stepped between him and the door. No, she said. He froze. I have not refused him care, she continued. I have refused to let his crown erase the people you put into the road. Severald's tone sharpened by a thread. This is precisely why royal care cannot be governed by grief. Widow Whitlock makes a prince bargain over his father's breath. Annora faced him. You made 12 families bargain with winter. Garrick inhaled, as if struck. Good. Let truth enter somewhere. Were wagons assigned? He asked. The clerk looked relieved to answer something simple. Then his relief died. No wagon list attached. Any confirmed palace. Approved place for any patient. No, Your Highness. The snow seemed louder after that. Annora reached through the doorway and took one folded ribbon from the nearest bed. Pale blue thread. A name stitched by hand. Hesta Ven, she said. 81. Bone fever. Cannot sleep flat. Needs right side hearthbed. She placed the ribbon on the ledger. Another. Edrin Hale. Failing lungs. Needs steam kettle before midnight. Another. Sova Merritt. Half lucid at dusk. Frightened by strange ceilings. Needs the north lamp left low. She placed each name where the reform had left blank space. Garrick did not interrupt. Several did. Private comfort notes are not transfer requirements. Annora looked up. They are how a person remains a person when the body has started leaving. The clerk's fingers trembled above the page. Garrick's voice changed. Did my order empty beds before new beds existed? The clerk looked at Several. Annora did not rescue either of them. Yes, Your Highness, he said. Several's expression held, but the polish had begun to harden. Procedure allowed assignment after transfer. Annora gathered the ribbons against her palm. You cannot transfer someone into a blank. A rider's horn sounded faintly from the road. One family returning. Maybe two. Not enough. Still a beginning that came before the king. Garrick looked at the door, the wolves, the ribbons, and finally at Annora. The first beds go back to the named patients. Not first, she said. By need. He swallowed. By need. Enter the receiving bed omission, Garrick ordered. Several's voice cooled. That will make reform timing look like abandonment. Annora opened the door wider, not for the king yet, but for the first returning lanterns in the snow. No, she said. It will say the beds were emptied before any other bed had been named. Receiving bed omission. The closure decree displaced Moonrest's terminal patients before palace-approved receiving beds were assigned. The receiving bed omission proved Moonrest's terminal patients had been displaced before palace-approved beds were assigned. It did not yet prove why Several Crane had certified Moonrest as redundant care without confirmed receiving capacity. The first returning lanterns came out of the storm like small, stubborn stars. Annora Whitlock opened Moonrest only as far as the threshold rule allowed. Hesta Ven came first because her breathing had worsened in the snow, not because her family cried loudest. Edrin Hale followed when his chest began to rattle. Sova Merritt was carried in last of the first group, whispering for the north lamp before she recognized the door. The dying Wolf King remained outside, beneath the royal winter wolves. Garrick Ossmere watched his father wait. He said nothing. That restraint did not repair what he had signed. It only kept fear from becoming another kind of crown. Several cranes stood beside the reform ledger, as if the returning patients were unfortunate weather. Projected capacity is accepted under reform planning, Your Highness. Annora laid Hesta's name ribbon beside the certificate. Read capacity beside the bodies. Garrick's eyes stayed on the paper because looking at the beds hurt more. What did redundant mean in your certification? Several answered smoothly. Duplicated service category. End-of-life care existed in palace. Approved channels. Moonrest was not the only provider. Annora looked toward Hesta, whose daughter held a cup to her lips with shaking hands. Ask whether redundant means replaced, or only inconvenient. Garrick's mouth tightened. Did redundancy require confirmed receiving beds? Under reform law, confirmed individual placement was not required before consolidation. Who calculated projected transfer capacity? My office, Several said. The clerk marked the answer with a trembling quill. Outside, one royal winter wolf shifted when the king coughed. The last road circle tightened by one paw length. Not judgment. Old moon law pressure, at a mercy threshold. Annora saw Garrick look toward his father. She stepped into his line of sight. Do not let fear make a second decree. His face tightened. I have not ordered him in. No, she said, but you want to. Pain moved through him. He accepted the sentence, without defense. Several's voice cooled. Widow Whitlock now interprets desire as policy. This is why grief cannot govern systems. Annora turned. A system that cannot hold a dying hand should stop calling itself care. A returning family stopped on the step with an old man wrapped in a horse blanket. Garrick saw them. So did the soldiers, clerks, and families who had remained to watch royal command become public accounting. Were terminal care beds counted separately? Garrick asked. The clerk checked the capacity sheet. No, Your Highness. General elder beds and terminal beds were combined under winter consolidation. Several nodded. Efficient distribution prevents waste. Annora's voice stayed low. A hospice bed is not the same as a spare cot near a stove. Did the certification list actual names or only totals? Garrick asked. Only totals. Did any approved channel confirm readiness? No confirmation attached. Several lifted one hand. Operational details could be completed after closure. Emergency winter pressure made consolidation necessary. Annora placed 3 ribbons beside the projected totals. Then more, taken from the stripped beds just inside the door. Each ribbon carried a name. Each name had a need. Right side hearth. Steam kettle. Low lamp. Quiet corner. Wife permitted to stay. No bell after dusk. Projected mercy cannot hold a dying hand, she said. It cannot remember which side hurts. It cannot tell a frightened woman that the same lamp will be there when she wakes. The clerk stopped writing. Garrick did not. Did my order rely on Severald's redundancy certificate? He asked. The clerk's answer came small. Yes, Your Highness. Severald looked at the prince, not Annora. The crown relied on lawful medical certification. Annora looked down at the ribbons spread over the clean arithmetic. Ask who counted categories instead of beds. Garrick's voice roughened. Did your certificate show that no palace, approved receiving beds had been assigned? No, the clerk said. Severald's polish hardened. Because the certificate addressed redundancy, not transfer logistics. A hospice can only be duplicate when another door has a name ready, Annora said. The old king's breath scraped in the cold. Garrick flinched. Annora heard it and hated that part of her still knew the shape of his fear. Once, after her mourning, he had stood outside her cottage through a long frost and said nothing because silence was all she could bear. Tonight he had to learn silence while his father waited for the beds he had emptied. Enter the capacity, certification contradiction, Garrick ordered. Severald's eyes sharpened. That will make accepted planning look negligent. Annora lifted Hesta's ribbon from the ledger and tied it back to the first bedpost. No, she said. It will say Moonrest was called redundant before one replacement bed had a name. Capacity certification contradiction. Severald Crane certified Moonrest Hospice as redundant care based on projected transfer capacity, although no palace-approved receiving beds had been assigned for its terminal patients. The capacity certification contradiction made Severald Crane's clean arithmetic look less like planning and more like a door drawn on paper. It did not yet prove why no palace wagons had been assigned before Moonrest's closure seal was nailed over the hospice door. Inside the threshold, Annora Whitlock moved patients by need, not noise. Hesta Venn had the right side hearth bed. Edrin Hale's steam kettle began to whisper. Sova Merritt lay beneath the north lamp, one thin hand closed around the ribbon Annora had tied back to her bedpost. Outside, Wolf King Ossmere still waited beneath the royal winter wolves. Snow gathered on Garrick Ossmere's shoulders. He did not shake it off. Severald Crane watched the open doorway as if each returned patient were a legal complication. Transport assignment could follow closure, Your Highness. Facility shutdown and patient movement are separate operational stages. Annora turned from Edrin's kettle. Read the road beside the beds. Garrick looked to the clerk. Were palace wagons assigned? The clerk opened the transport section of the reform ledger. Blank lines ran where names should have been. No wagon list attached, Your Highness. Severald's voice remained level. Families were permitted to transport patients. Many prefer familiar. Annora stepped into the doorway. They were not permitted. They were left. Garrick's eyes lifted to her. There was pain in them. And worse, understanding arriving too late to be useful. Who was responsible for transport? He asked. The clerk read from the decree margin. Winter Physician's Office to coordinate with Palace Roads after closure. After closure, Annora repeated. Severald answered before Garrick could. Winter wagons were reserved for urgent royal roads. No formal transport failure exists until a patient is lost. The oldest wolf's head lifted slightly. Not judgment. Old moon law stillness beside a failing sovereign. Annora's voice stayed quiet. Ask whether a body can be transferred by permission alone. Garrick's jaw hardened. Were families told to carry patients themselves? No written instruction, Your Highness, the clerk said. The notice only states that families may accompany transfer. Annora looked toward the returning lanterns. They accompanied nothing. They became the wagons. A soldier near the step swallowed hard. Severald turned enough for the soldiers and clerks to hear him clearly. Emergency reform cannot wait for every cart to be polished and blessed. Temporary family movement reduced burden on the winter roads. A daughter carrying her mother on a doorboard is not road management, Annora said. The words made Garrick close his eyes for one breath. When he opened them, he looked at the ledger. Not at her. Not for rescue. Did the closure order include a transport list? No. Were winter road risks assessed? The clerk searched another page. No assessment attached. Several's patience thinned. The hospice sits within walking distance of 3 approved channels. Annora's gaze sharpened. For soldiers, not for lungs that fail in cold air. Edrin coughed inside Moonrest, a deep, wet sound that made the nearest wolf press its paws harder into the snow. Garrick heard it. Did any patient have a scheduled pickup? No, Your Highness. Was Annora notified of transport support? No support notice appears. Severald's mouth tightened. Moonrest's staff were expected to cooperate with transition. Annora looked at him. Reform closed my door, emptied my beds, and then expected my hands to carry what your wagons did not. Garrick flinched as if she had not raised her voice because she had not needed to. Behind her, Hesta's daughter whispered for more blankets. Annora moved at once, took one from the shelf, and handed it over without breaking the questioning. That was what Garrick watched, the way she could account and care in the same breath, while his government had done neither. Did my seal go on the door before movement was secured? He asked. The clerk looked down. Yes, Your Highness. Severald stepped forward. The seal ended facility operation. Transport scheduling was an operational matter, not a closure condition. Annora returned to the threshold. Then your operation ended care before hands arrived to replace it. A rider came in from the road, shaking snow from his cloak. 3 more found, Your Highness. One cannot be moved without a covered wagon. Garrick turned to Severald. Send palace wagons. Severald's eyes hardened. If we divert royal winter wagons now, the palace infirmary loses emergency capacity. Garrick looked toward his father beneath the wolves, then toward Moonrest's open beds. This was where fear could have made him choose blood over law. Annora watched him and did not help. Send them, he said. My father waits under last road rule. So will my convenience. Severald went still. Annora let the order stand, but she did not soften. The first correct carriage did not erase the ones that never came. Enter the wagon. Assignment omission, Garrick ordered. Severald's voice cooled into ice. That will make a scheduling delay look like abandonment. Annora looked past him to the dark road where old people had been carried by love because the crown sent no wheels. No, she said. It will say the door was sealed before anyone was assigned to carry them safely away. Wagon assignment omission. No palace wagons were assigned to transfer Moonrest's terminal patients before the closure seal was nailed over the hospice door. The first palace wagons did not arrive with bells. They came with blankets, closed lanterns, and drivers who kept their eyes low because every wheel reached Moonrest too late. Annora Whitlock stood at the threshold and counted patients in, not apologies. Hesta Venn slept beside the right hearth. Edrin Hale's breathing eased under steam. Sova Merritt had stopped whispering after Annora lowered the north lamp. Outside, Wolf King Ossmere still waited beneath the royal winter wolves. The old moon law had patience. Fathers and sons rarely did. Garrick Ossmere stood in falling snow, while the first covered wagon brought back a man whose family had carried him halfway to a locked parish infirmary. The prince's face tightened at every cough, every shaking hand, every name ribbon tied back where it belonged. Severald Crane watched the returns as if inconvenience had learned to breathe. Your Highness, he said, this cannot become a general audit. Emergency correction has been made. The king requires admission. Annora looked at the third wagon, then at the reform ledger still open on the threshold table. Read the allowance beside the discharge. Severald's eyes cooled. Care allowances are not relevant to transport failure. Garrick turned toward the clerk. Open them! The clerk hesitated. The royal allowance pages, Your Highness? All of them connected to Moonrest. Severald stepped forward. One royal winter wolf shifted, not threatening, only tightening the last road line when a voice pushed too near the mercy threshold. Old moon law pressure. Severald stopped. The clerk opened a thin gray ledger Annora had never been allowed to read. It listed terminal care allowances granted to each elder under crown protection. Garrick's voice roughened. What happened to the allowances when patients were transferred? Severald answered before the clerk could. Unused care portions returned to central winter medical funds. Standard procedure. Annora looked at him. Ask whose fund. The snow seemed to thin around that question. Garrick looked at the clerk. The clerk looked terrified. Whose fund? Garrick repeated. Winter Physician's discretionary relief account, the clerk said. Severald's mouth tightened. A managed account, used for emergency needs. Annora placed Hesta's ribbon beside the allowance page. Hesta Venn was given a 10-day hearthcare allowance. The clerk read. Reduced to 3 days after transition classification. She was not transitioned, Annora said. She was carried through snow. Garrick's hand closed at his side. Annora laid down Edrin's ribbon. Edrin Hale had steam care funded through the thaw. The clerk read lower, shortened to 2 days upon consolidation. Edrin coughed inside Moonrest, the sound raw enough to make Garrick turn. Annora did not let him leave the page. Stay with the record, she said. His eyes came back to hers. Pain there. Obedience too late. He stayed. Severald's voice remained careful. Terminal allowances are adjusted when services duplicate or when family-supported transition reduces institutional burden. A wife holding a dying man upright in a snow ditch is not institutional support, Annora said. A driver outside lowered his head. The clerk turned another page without being asked. Sova Merritt. Allowance shortened after Moonrest closure. 2 more names. Then 5. Then every returned patient, whose bed had been stripped before receiving care, existed. Garrick spoke quietly. Were there unused allowances returned today? The clerk's fingers trembled. Initial returns were entered after the closure seal. To Severald's discretionary account? Yes, Your Highness. Severald lifted one hand. Temporary return. If patients are reassigned, funds can be redistributed. Annora turned to him. Can be is not care. The words struck softly. That made them worse. The Wolf King's breath rattled outside, thin and uneven. Garrick looked toward him again, and this time Annora saw something break open in him that was not fear alone. Understanding had found his father by passing through everyone else first. Did my order free those allowances? He asked. Severald's answer came smooth. Your reform enabled efficient redistribution. That was not my question. The clerk whispered, Yes, Your Highness. Garrick looked at Annora. She knew that look. The old winter tenderness, wounded now by shame. The part of him that wanted her to say he had been deceived, that ledgers had hidden the shape of harm too well for any prince to know. She gave him nothing soft to hide in. You did not count the beds, she said. You counted the man who told you they were waste. He swallowed once. Yes, he said. Not enough. But true. Severald's face hardened by one exact degree. Your Highness, accusations of fund misuse require more than emotional arithmetic. Annora looked at the allowance pages, the ribbons, and the wagons still arriving too late. Then keep reading until arithmetic stops sounding clean. Garrick nodded to the clerk. Enter the allowance, return pattern. Severald's eyes sharpened. That will imply lawful reallocation was theft. Annora picked up Sova's ribbon and tied it back to the north lamp bed before answering. No, she said. It will say care was shortened on paper while bodies were still trying to survive the road. Allowance return pattern. After Moonrest Hospice was sealed, unused terminal care allowances from displaced patients were entered for return to Winter Physician Severald Crane's discretionary relief account before those patients had confirmed receiving beds, transport support, or continued care. The allowance return pattern did not make Severald Crane look careless. It made him look useful to a crown that had wanted dying people to cost less. Annora Whitlock did not say that aloud. Not yet. Moonrest filled by lantern and breath. One bed at a time, the stripped rooms returned to their proper names. Hesta Venn warmed beside the right-side hearth. Edrin Hale slept in steam. Sova Merritt opened her eyes under the low north lamp and whispered, Home, as if the word had been waiting in the walls. Outside, Wolf King Ossmere remained beneath the royal winter wolves. Garrick stood at the threshold with snow in his hair and shame on his face. Annora, he said. She did not turn from tying a name ribbon. Do not use my name to shorten the line. His breath caught. Severald's voice came colder than before. Your Highness? His Majesty's continued exposure now risks avoidable decline. Annora faced him. Then perhaps the palace should not have closed the only door his wolves would cross. Garrick looked at his father. The king's breath had grown thinner. The lead wolf pressed its body closer, lending heat through fur and old law. The circle had not broken. It would not carry him across a threshold that had not finished admitting need. "How many remain on the road?" Garrick asked. The clerk checked the rider marks. 4 patients still unreturned, Your Highness. 2 found, 2 not yet reached. Several stepped toward the threshold. The wolves shifted as one, paws pressing deeper into snow. Old moon law boundary. Nothing more. He stopped. This is untenable. Mercy cannot require the sovereign to wait for every village elder. Annora's eyes sharpened. Mercy requires the sovereign to learn he is not the only body winter can take. The words struck Garrick hard enough that his hand opened at his side. Once, after her husband died, he had waited outside her cottage until her candle went out, not entering, not speaking, only refusing to leave her grief alone in the lane. She had mistaken that patience for character. Tonight, patience had to become law, where feeling had failed. Garrick's voice lowered. "Tell me what must happen before my father enters." Annora looked at him across the cut seal. "Every returning patient must be accounted for. Every bed must be assigned by need. Every allowance you freed must be marked, held for care, not returned to Severald's account. Then the king enters as a patient, not as a crown." Severald's mouth tightened. "You condition royal care on administrative humiliation." "No," Annora said. "I condition care on care." A rider arrived with 2 more lanterns behind him. One patient came wrapped in quilts, feverish and trembling. The other was a silent old woman carried by 3 sons who had taken turns through the snow until their hands could no longer close. Annora moved at once. "South wall," she told the first family, "not near the draft." Then to the sons, "Blue bed, warm stones, no bright lamp." Garrick stepped forward to help. Annora stopped him with one lifted hand. "Ask before touching them." He froze. The sons stared at the wolf prince as if the old world had broken. Garrick lowered his head toward them. "May I carry her?" The eldest son swallowed. "If you keep her feet warm." "I will." He took the old woman carefully, awkward with royal strength forced into gentleness. Annora watched, because she had to be sure. He did not rush. He did not look toward his father while carrying another family's mother inside. That was the first thing he had done all night that did not ask to be witnessed by her. It was witnessed anyway. When he came back, his face was pale. "I did not know the allowances returned before care continued." Annora tied the blue ribbon to the bedpost. "No, but you closed the door before knowing where the dying would sleep." He accepted it. Several did not. A prince must act from trusted offices. If every royal decision waits for bedside detail, government collapses. Annora turned toward him. Government already collapsed. The beds had to catch it. The final rider came near midnight, alone. "No sign of Nella Croft," he said. "Her nephew took the east road before the snow thickened. We are still searching." A sound left one of the wolves, low and old. The king's eyelids fluttered. Garrick took one step toward him. Annora stepped with him, blocking the door again. One bed remains unaccounted. Severald's face sharpened. "You would leave the Wolf King in snow over one missing woman?" "I would not let one missing woman become invisible because the Wolf King is cold." Garrick looked at her then, and whatever fear remained in him had to kneel before the thing he had done. "Send my personal guard east," he said. "No palace banner, no horns, blankets and a covered sleigh." Annora did not soften, but she moved aside when the clerk marked every returned patient, held every allowance, and assigned the last empty bed to Nella Croft pending arrival. Only then did the lead wolf rise. The royal winter wolves lifted the king together and crossed Moonrest's threshold. Not because he was king, because the Mercy House had made room by rule. Equal admission record. Annora Whitlock admitted Moonrest's displaced terminal patients by need, held their care allowances for treatment, and allowed the Wolf King to cross the mercy threshold only after royal priority no longer erased the missing and returned patients. The Wolf King entered Moonrest as the last patient of the night, not the first. That was the only reason Annora Whitlock allowed the royal cloak to cross her threshold. Inside, the old king was placed in the south alcove, away from drafts, near enough to the hearth for warmth but not so close that fever would rise. The royal winter wolves settled outside the windows in a white ring, bodies half buried in snow, their breath clouding the glass with old moon law patience. Garrick Ossmere stood just inside the door and did not approach his father until Annora finished tying Nella Croft's empty ribbon to the final bedpost. "May I stand beside him?" he asked. Annora looked at the bed first, quietly. The word carried more weight than permission. Garrick accepted it. Severald Crane watched from the threshold, where the wolves allowed him to stand but not enter. "Your Highness, this has gone far beyond emergency correction. The hospice is operating under a dissolved status." Annora did not look away from the king's pulse. "Then the dissolved status is receiving better care than the palace provided alive." Garrick flinched. "Good. A wound should know when it is earned." He turned to the clerk. "Bring the closure decree inside." Severald's brows lowered. "Why?" "Because I signed it here in everything but location," Garrick said. "It will be read where it harmed." The clerk brought the black ledger, the reform notice, the transport section, the allowance entries, and the name ribbons Annora had not tied back yet. Families gathered along the walls. Soldiers stood with their helmets under their arms. No one laughed now. No one called candlelight denial while old breaths struggled under blankets. Garrick stood before them without the prince's dais, without a horse, without Severald's shoulder near enough to borrow certainty. "Read the decree," he said. The clerk read. "Moonrest Hospice dissolved as redundant care. Elder and terminal patients transferred to palace-approved channels as capacity permits." Annora's hands paused over a bowl of warm water. She had heard those words outside in snow. Inside, they sounded worse. Garrick looked at the families. "Now read what was attached." The clerk swallowed. "No receiving bed list, no wagon assignment, no confirmed placement, no winter road risk review, terminal and elder beds combined under projected capacity." Severald's voice cut in. "Those matters have already been entered." Garrick looked at him. "Not before the people who carried what my order abandoned." The first act of repair was not tenderness. It was exposure. Annora let it stand because it served the patients, not because it served him. Garrick turned to Hesta Ven's daughter. "Your mother's bed was not named before I closed this house." The woman gripped the cup in her hands. "No, Your Highness." "To Edrin Hale's wife," he said, voice rougher. No steam support was assigned. She shook her head once. "To Sova Merritt's niece. No lamp instruction, no placement, no wagon." "No," the girl whispered. Garrick closed his eyes for one breath. When he opened them, he looked at Annora. She saw the plea before he spoke it, and killed it with her stillness. He turned back to the room instead. "The wrong was public enough to empty this house. The correction will be public enough to fill the record." Severald stepped forward. One wolf outside rose, visible through the window. Old moon law boundary. Severald stopped at the sill line. "Your Highness, emotional testimony cannot replace medical administration." Annora finally looked at him. "It does not replace administration. It names what yours failed to carry." Garrick set his hand on the closure decree. "Moonrest is reopened under emergency last road protection until a public throne review is completed." A murmur moved through the room. Severald's face hardened. Temporary protection implies the closure may stand after review. Annora turned toward Garrick. "Will it?" The room stilled in a dozen small ways. A cup stopped halfway to Hesta's lips. Edrin's steam kettle hissed. Sova's fingers tightened around the blanket edge. Garrick met Annora's eyes. Once, that would have been where romance lived between them. Unspoken, restrained, made dangerous by grief and rank. Tonight she needed law, not longing. "No," he said, "but I will not use my sudden understanding to write over yours. Moonrest's permanent law will come from the people who know what dying care requires." Annora felt the words strike something tender. She did not let him see it. "Then write that," she said. The clerk bent over the ledger. Garrick continued. "All returned allowances remain held for patient care. All families displaced tonight may testify before the throne review. Severald Crane's office will produce every closure, transfer, allowance, and denial record connected to Moonrest." Severald went still. "That exceeds the scope of emergency correction." "No," Garrick said. "It reaches the size of my mistake." Annora looked at him then, despite herself. He did not reach for her. He did not ask if that was enough. Good. Because it was not. Outside, the royal winter wolves lowered their heads against the snow, not bowing, only settling as the threshold record changed under old law. Garrick turned to Annora. "What else?" She looked at the beds, the families, the king, the empty place where Nella still had not arrived. Find the missing woman before you ask this house to praise your repair. His face tightened. I will. Public Care Review Order. Wolf Prince Garrick Ossmere ordered the Moonrest closure decree, receiving bed omissions, wagon omissions, allowance returns, and patient name ribbons read before displaced families, then reopened Moonrest under emergency last road protection, pending a throne review led by those harmed by the closure. Nella Croft came back at dawn in a covered sleigh with frost in her hair and Garrick Ossmere's cloak over her feet. Annora Whitlock did not thank the prince first. She checked Nella's pulse, warmed her hands, and listened when the old woman whispered that the East Road had gone white and her nephew could not carry her farther. Only after Nella was placed in the last bed did Annora look at Garrick. You found her, she said. His face was gray, with sleepless cold. My guard found her. I only sent them. Good, she thought. Let him learn not to steal gentleness from those who did the carrying. Moonrest breathed like a wounded thing finding rhythm again. Hesta's hearth gave steady heat. Edrin's kettle murmured. Sova slept beneath the low north lamp. Wolf King Ossmere lay in the south alcove, watched through the window by the royal winter wolves, whose bodies formed a pale ring beyond the glass. Several cranes stood near the record table. Now that the missing patient has been recovered, Your Highness, the emergency should return to proper palace supervision. Annora tied Nella's ribbon to the final bedpost. No, the word was quiet. It reached every corner. Garrick looked at her. Tell me what rule you are invoking. Not invoking, she said, writing. Severald's mouth tightened. Widow Whitlock cannot write royal care law from a hospice floor. Annora turned toward him. Then perhaps royal care law should stop being written by men who call empty beds efficiency. A few families lifted their heads. Garrick did not defend Severald. He did not defend himself either. That was better. Annora took the old Moon Law Mercy Register from the threshold table and placed beside it the closure decree, the wagon omission, the allowance return pages, and 12 name ribbons. No magic rose. No wolf spoke. Paper remained paper. Ribbon remained thread. That was enough. This house will not reopen as a royal favor, she said. It reopens under hospice authority. Severald gave a thin smile. A pretty phrase. Authority requires funding, jurisdiction, and medical oversight. Then write them where families can hear, Annora said. Garrick turned to the clerk. Record her terms. Severald's eyes sharpened. Your Highness. Garrick's voice cut low. The court heard me close it. The patients will hear how it is protected. Annora felt the line come near her heart and refused to let it enter yet. She faced the families instead. First term, no end, of Life House may be closed until each patient has a named receiving bed, transport assigned, and care allowance locked to that patient. The clerk wrote, Second, terminal care cannot be counted with general elder capacity. Dying is not a category to hide inside a total. Edrin's wife began to cry without sound. Third, family presence, bed position, heat, quiet, final letters, and fear instructions are not comfort notes. They are care requirements. Severald's voice cooled. This makes sentiment enforceable. Annora looked at him. Yes. The answer unsettled him more than argument. Garrick watched her, as if seeing the room build itself around her words. Once, after her mourning, his restraint had made her feel less alone. Tonight, restraint was not enough. He had to give law to what he once only pitied. What else? He asked. Annora turned toward the south alcove. The king's breath was shallow, but his eyes had opened. Fourth, she said, softer now. A sovereign is admitted by need, not rank. The last road wolves may bring him to mercy. They may not make his crown first at the door. One royal winter wolf outside lifted its head. Not approval. Threshold response to a rule being named in the proper place. Severald stepped back from the window. Wolf King Ossmere's lips moved. Garrick bent instinctively, then stopped and looked to Annora. She nodded once. He leaned close. The old king whispered, She is right. The room changed, not with triumph, with grief finally given a witness. Garrick's eyes closed. Annora did not soften for him. Fifth, she said, and her voice regained its edge. No physician's office may receive returned terminal care allowance until the patient is dead. transferred into named care, or released by family testimony before a mercy clerk. Severald's face lost color for the first time. Only a little. Enough. That is financial accusation disguised as policy, he said. No, Annora answered. It is a lock on the door you used in the ledger. Garrick turned sharply toward Severald. Annora let him look. She would not explain the full shape yet. That belonged in the throne hall, before ledgers, witnesses, and the king. Will you sign this? Garrick asked her. Annora looked at the ink, then at the patients, then at the wolves waiting beyond glass. No, she said, they will. She placed the pen before the families first. Hospice law begins with the people who had to survive its absence. Hospice authority claim. Annora Whitlock claimed authority over Moonrest's future care by requiring named, receiving beds, assigned transport, locked patient allowances, family testimony, and need-based admission before any royal reform could close or control an end-of-life mercy house. The families signed before the crown did. That was why the throne hall had to open. By noon, Moonrest Hospice had warmed enough to breathe. The missing and returned patients slept beneath their proper ribbons. Wolf King Ossmere lay awake in the south alcove, too weak to rise, but strong enough to know Annora Whitlock had made his son wait outside the order he had broken. Garrick Ossmere did not ask her to come to the palace. He brought the palace to the care record. The throne hall doors opened to families, clerks, soldiers, and hospice workers. The royal winter wolves entered last, not in battle formation, but in last road procession. Between two of them hung a locked iron satchel dusted with snow. Severald Crane saw it and went still. What is that? Garrick asked. The lead wolf lowered the satchel before the king's chair. It did not bow. It completed a last road delivery under old moon law. Final belongings and testimony carried with a failing sovereign when ordinary custody could no longer be trusted. Severald's voice stayed calm. Old personal effects. His Majesty should not endure theatrics. The Wolf King opened his eyes. Read it. The lock bore the king's private moon mark. Garrick looked at his father. You kept this from me. The king's breath scraped. I feared. You trusted him. Severald stepped forward. Majesty, fever can tangle suspicion with memory. Annora turned. Then let the ledger untangle it. The clerk opened the satchel. Inside were treatment ledgers, allowance transfers, and sealed notes in the Wolf King's own hand. Garrick's voice hardened. Read the first ledger. Hesteven, the clerk said. Hearthcare allowance shortened from 10 days to 3. Unused portion returned to winter physician discretionary relief. Hesta's daughter gripped her mother's chair. Edrin Hale. Steam treatment reduced. Unused portion returned. Sova Merit. Night. Watch allowance reduced after cognitive decline classification. Unused portion returned. Severald's face held. Adjustments followed medical priority. Terminal decline requires realistic allocation. Annora looked at him. You shortened care because they were dying. No, because prolonged care offered limited recovery. The old king stirred. Recovery, he whispered, was never the only mercy. The clerk read deeper. Each page carried the same shape. Shortened treatment, reduced allowance, return to Severald's account, no receiving bed named, no family testimony, no mercy clerk release. Then the private notes. Garrick said, read them. In the Wolf King's hand, I sent funds quietly to Moonrest because Severald's office shortens care when death is near. Annora Whitlock does not spend coin to postpone death. She spends it so no one is treated as already gone. The throne hall did not gasp. A physician's assistant began to cry over her record tray. A winter guard pressed one hand against his eyes. The scribe who had sealed Moonrest's closure copy stared at the wax knife on his belt. Severald's voice sharpened. Private suspicion is not proof of theft. No, Annora said. The transfers are. Garrick faced him. Did unused terminal, care allowances return to your private relief fund before care continued? Severald looked toward the ledgers. Too late. Yes, the clerk said. Did my father fund Moonrest separately because he suspected it? The Wolf King's fingers moved on the chair arm. Yes, he whispered. Garrick lowered his head. Not to Severald. To Annora and the families. I closed the house that was protecting my father. I signed the decree. I stayed mounted while patients were carried into snow. I asked this door to open for blood after my order had emptied it of names. His voice broke, but he did not stop. The wrong was mine in public. The law will be corrected in public. He turned to the guards. Severed Crane is removed from Winter Medical Authority, pending tribunal for shortened terminal treatment, allowance diversion, false redundancy certification, and concealment of continuing care needs. Several looked at Annora. You have made death expensive. Annora stepped forward. No, I have made it impossible for you to profit from people being considered finished. The royal winter wolves lifted their heads at the word finished. Old Moon Law witness. Nothing more. Enough. The Wolf King reached for Annora's hand. She let him take it. Moonrest, he breathed, was never waste. No, she said softly. It was where you were allowed to be afraid. His eyes closed with peace. Garrick stayed across the hall, waiting for grief to finish before touching his own. Later, when the king still breathed but slept, Garrick came no closer than the space Annora allowed. Will you lead the new law? He asked. I will lead Moonrest, she said. The law will answer to its patients. And me? You may wait outside any door you have not earned. His throat moved. I will. If I open one again, she said, it will be because you learned to protect care before it is your own grief asking. Garrick bowed his head. Then I will learn before asking. Annora turned back to Moonrest's families, ribbons, and wolves. She had not been chosen by them. She had been recognized by the work she refused to abandon. Final Mercy Ledger Reversal. The Royal Winter Wolves delivered the Wolf King's hidden treatment ledgers to the throne hall, exposing that Severed Crane shortened terminal care and redirected unused allowances, while the king secretly funded Moonrest because Annora Whitlock preserved end-of-life dignity when the palace counted dying patients as savings.